So, on behalf of your dedicated men and women of Classic, I am honored to present the return of another Titan.
This is getting the band back together now. This is how it should be, because we all were there for the original from the inception of it, and it was such an exciting time.
Here we go. Jump commit in 3, 2, 1.
A new age is upon us.
At the 2017 Gamescom convention, Microsoft announced the definitive addition to the first Age of Empires game, as well as the newest strategy game in the series yet to come, Age of Empires 4. At BlizzCon in 2018, Blizzard announced Warcraft 3 Reforged, a remastered version of the popular and original real-time strategy game Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos, and its expansion, The Frozen Throne. Shortly afterward, EA would announce, in partnership with Petroglyph Games, that the original Command & Conquer and Command & Conquer Red Alert games would also be remastered for modern PC systems. At E3 2019, Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition would be announced, and in August 2019, Homeworld 3, sequel to the critically acclaimed Homeworld 1 and 2 RTS games, would be coming back sometime in the year 2022. As I'm sure many of you can tell by now, what all of these games, and others that I had not mentioned, have in common with each other is that all of them are part of the real-time strategy game genre, more commonly referred to as RTS. A genre that many people I think would describe as being dead due to the lack of RTS games that have been released in the past roughly 8 or more years now. But suddenly, with the announcements of these new remastered games and sequels, as well as completely new entries into the genre, such as Iron Harvest by King Art Games and A Year of Rain by Daedalic Entertainment, it begs the question, is this the start of a new era for real-time strategy games? Is the genre about to be resurrected or revitalized and return to its former glory after many years of decline? Well, in order to answer that question, we first need to go back in time and take a look at the games that defined the genre's early years, ultimately leading to its golden age and its eventual decline into the present day.
The planet Arrakis, known as Dune.
If you ask most people what was the first RTS game ever made, I think many would say Dune 2, The Building of a Dynasty, based off the 1984 movie Dune created by David Lynch, which was, in turn, based off the popular science fiction novel written by Frank Herbert. The game was developed by Westwood Studios and published by Virgin Games. The game was released in December 1992 for MS-DOS, and was ported and released for the Amiga and Sega Genesis, or the Mega Drive as it was known outside North America, in 1993. Now, Dune 2 is not the first real-time strategy game ever made. That title actually goes to a Sega Genesis game called Herzog Zei, released in 1989. This is the game that most inspired the making of Dune 2. However, Dune 2 is the one that ultimately popularized the RTS genre, leading to its rise in the mid to late 90s with titles such as Command & Conquer and Warcraft. Brett Sperry, who was the founder and president of Westwood Studios, came up with the name real-time strategy in order to help market this new game genre. What made Dune 2 such an influential game wasn't necessarily any one unique gameplay or design element, but the combination of different gameplay and design elements from other previous games all combined into one. Base building had the player constructing buildings that allowed them to construct units to use to defend their base with and attack the enemy's base in return. Some buildings would provide power for the base, which would allow the player to construct more buildings, and with more buildings, allow the player to construct more units. In Dune 2, the player would first have to place a concrete slab as a foundation for buildings. These slabs could be constructed on rocky surfaces and not sand. Though buildings could be constructed without the slabs, they would take damage over time due to the harsh environment of the planet of Arrakis. In order to construct buildings and units, one needs resources. In most RTS games, resource gathering is usually done by gathering units, but it can also sometimes be auto-generated by certain buildings or nodes, either at the player's base or elsewhere on the map. It is important for the player to not only defend their gatherers from attacks by either the enemy player or environmental hazards, but also acquire more resources on other areas of the map, as the player will inevitably run out of the resources that they have nearby their base at the start of a mission. And when one runs out of resources, that will ultimately lead to defeat. The spice is the resource needed to be gathered in Dune 2. The starting missions of the game even require that you collect a certain amount of it as an objective to complete for the mission. But the player also needs to destroy the enemy base as the secondary objective. The spice is harvested by harvester units, which automatically spawn from the refinery building when it is constructed. Once the harvesters gather all the spice in a given area, or until their carrying capacity is full, they return the spice to the refineries, which processes it into credits, which are used to construct more units and buildings, which are used to ultimately defeat the enemy AI.
Your mission is complete.
The Fog of War made the importance of players scouting and exploring of the map in order to find resources to gather, as well as finding the location of the enemy base or any of their units on the map. Once the fog has been uncovered, that part of the map is always seen and known to the player, and if the player has built a radar outpost, they can see the uncovered areas and both friendly and enemy units on the minimap. At least, this is how the Fog of War worked in Dune 2 and other early RTS games. But the Fog of War mechanic would evolve to work differently in future RTS games, such as revealing any environmental assets such as buildings, terrain, and foliage. But actual units and their movements from the opposing AI or opposing player will still be hidden, unless seen by either of the player's own units close enough to the enemies, or from a special building or ability the player can use to see through the fog in a specific part of the map, whether temporarily or permanently. Micromanagement of units and buildings, primarily using the mouse. The reason this is an important element to mention is because the game that most inspired the making of Dune 2, Herzog Zei, was released on the Sega Genesis. Due to this game being on a console, all unit movement and menu navigation was done using a controller. Compared to a console controller, the mouse provided greater fluid interaction, with selecting and moving units, constructing buildings, and navigating menus. Other gameplay elements featured in Dune 2 was letting the player choose between 3 factions to play as: House Atreides, House Harkonnen, and House Ordos. Each faction specializing in different playstyles and having access to unique units, such as House Harkonnen having strong but expensive units, and House Ordos having units that focus on speed but lack firepower. The game also featured a campaign map that allowed the player to choose which region they wanted their next mission to take place, and environmental hazards such as sandworms that would devour vehicles or infantry that were in their way. However, I think the design elements of Fog of War, resource gathering, base building, and micro and macro management of units and economy, all while everything plays out in real time, make up the core pillars of a real-time strategy game. And these core pillars would be the basis for many future games in the genre moving forward. Dune 2 was a commercial success for Westwood Studios, and the game was highly praised by game magazines at the time, with Computer Gaming World naming it Strategy Game of the Year in 1993. However, even with the success of Dune 2, no new RTS games would be seen for the next couple of years. At least not until a small game company called Blizzard Entertainment, founded by Mike Morhaime, Frank Pierce, and Alan Adam in Irvine, California, would release their first RTS game exclusively on the PC.
With an ingenious arsenal of weaponry and powerful magic, these two forces collide in a contest of cunning, intellect, and brute strength, with the victor claiming dominance over the whole of Azeroth. Welcome to the world of Warcraft.
Warcraft, Orcs and Humans was released in November 1994 for MS-DOS.
Yes, my lord. Yes. Yes, my lord. Yes.
Warcraft brought RTS players into a fantasy setting with two factions, Orcs and Humans, with both sides battling for dominance across the lands of Azeroth. The game still held the four pillars of an RTS, featuring base building, resource gathering, fog of war, and micromanagement. But it also came with various improvements. Instead of having to only worry about one resource, players now had to gather two resources. Those resources being gold and wood. You could select up to 4 units at the same time, unlike in Dune 2, where you could only select 1 unit at a time. There were multiple mission types, such as both the player and enemy AI not being able to build a base, and having limited numbers of units to command, requiring the player to be more tactical in their micromanagement of said units. You could jump to different parts on the game map using the minimap. And most importantly, the game featured modem and LAN multiplayer between 2 players. Warcraft Orcs and Humans was such a success for Blizzard that it gave the company the financial stability it needed in order to move forward and make future video games.
You have finally assumed your rightful place as ruler of this realm and as war chief of the Orcish clans.
Gamers wouldn't have to wait long for the next RTS game to be released, and from Westwood, the developers of Dune 2. This time, though, it would be the studio's own original IP.
Are you picking this up? Good.
Command & Conquer was released in September 1995. The game was set in an alternate parallel universe of the 1990s, based off the real-life Gulf War. It featured 2 unique playable factions, each with its own campaign. The Global Defense Initiative, GDI, against the Brotherhood of Nod. Both factions vying for global dominance, while an alien crystal known as Tiberium spreads quickly throughout the world, destroying the Earth's natural environments, but also proving to be a valuable resource for harvesting and refinement. Command & Conquer improved on all aspects of Dune 2. The biggest improvement, in my opinion, being the UI, as it was now easier to construct buildings and units using the sidebar menu. Buildings no longer required concrete slabs to be built on, as well as being able to select multiple units. A variety of mission types, some of which did not involve base building, similar to Warcraft 1. Upgraded 2D graphics and live-action cutscenes, with Joe Kukan playing the charismatic leader of Nod, Kane.
I am Kane.
And multiplayer with up to 4 players via LAN, and eventually over an internet connection with the release of Command & Conquer Gold in 1996. Of course, the game also features a phenomenal soundtrack from the game's composer, Frank Klepacki.
Lost.
Non-affirmative.
Building. Unit ready. Building. Unit ready. Building.
The game was a commercial success for Westwood Studios, receiving positive reviews across various game media outlets. By April 1996, the game had sold 500,000 copies worldwide, and over 1 million copies later in September of that year.
Unit lost. Battle control terminated.
The once mighty army of Azeroth lay among the blackened and charred remains of Stormwind Keep.
those that escaped fled across the Great Sea, bringing tales of the suffering they had faced at the hands of the Orcish hordes.
Blizzard would release the next game in the Warcraft universe in December 1995 for PC and Mac OS. Warcraft 2: Tides of Darkness. The game was a direct sequel from the first, with the humans and orcs once again being pitted against each other in battle. Only this time with the help of other races, such as dwarves and elves for the humans and ogres and trolls for the orcs. In terms of gameplay, Warcraft 2 remained mostly the same compared to its predecessor. But when it came to how Fog of War worked, there was a change. Terrain, buildings, rocks, and foliage would be visible for areas that were explored, but the actual enemy units and their movements could not be seen, unless one of the player's own units saw them within its vision radius. A couple of new resources were added to the game, those being oil and food. The biggest and more obvious addition to the game were the naval and air units. Unique hero units were also featured in the game, and some campaign missions required the player to keep them alive, or else they would fail that mission. Many of these heroes, such as Uther Lightbringer for the Alliance, and Gul'dan for the Horde, would be seen in future games set in the Warcraft universe. Warcraft 2 was another commercial success for Blizzard. The game had sold 500,000 copies worldwide within 3 months of release, and over 1.2 million by November 1996. Westwood would proudly present Command & Conquer Red Alert in November 1996 on Windows 95. Red Alert would act as a prequel to the original Command & Conquer, showing the events that would ultimately lead to the rise of Nod and GDI. The game was set in an alternate universe where Einstein gets rid of Adolf Hitler, preventing the rise of the Third Reich in Germany, but in doing so causes a war between the Allies and the Soviet Union for control of mainland Europe. Once again, the game kept the FMV-styled mission briefings. In terms of gameplay, it remained mostly the same to its predecessor. Both the Soviets and Allies factions each have their own unique strengths and weaknesses, such as the Soviets having slower but more powerful vehicles, and stronger defenses such as the Tesla Tower, while the Allies have cheap but agile units that can also be built faster. Red Alert was another financial success for Westwood. Its sales in the United States in 1996 brought revenues of $16.5 million, and by the end of the year 1997, it was the country's 8th best seller among computer games. The game would also receive 2 expansions, Counter-Strike and The Aftermath, which include new missions, maps, music, and units. By October of 1997, Counter-Strike had sold 650,000 copies worldwide, making it the all-time fastest-selling expansion pack for the PC at the time.
Comrade Chairman, I am the future.
So at this point, the video is really feeling like it's just Westwood Studios and Blizzard Entertainment being the stars of the RTS genre. And from 1992 to 1997, they were. Not just in their first-party titles, but also in the various expansions for those titles as well, such as the Covert Operations for Command & Conquer, and as previously mentioned, the Counter-Strike and Aftermath expansions for Red Alert, with the expansion Beyond the Dark Portal being released for Warcraft 2. But with the success of their games, other studios started to take notice and wanted to get in on this new rising genre video game. And 1997 would see 2 new major contenders release their own unique titles.
What began as a conflict over the transfer of consciousness from flesh to machines escalated into a war which has decimated 1 million worlds. The core and the arm have all but exhausted the resources of a galaxy in their struggle for domination. Both sides now crippled beyond repair, the remnants of their armies continue to battle on ravaged planets, their hatred fueled by over 4,000 years of total war. This is a fight to the death. For each side, the only acceptable outcome is the complete elimination of the other.
Total Annihilation was released in September 1997. Developed by Cavedog Entertainment and led by designer Chris Taylor, who himself was inspired by the Command & Conquer games. The game was set in the far future, with two factions, the Core and the Arm, both battling for total domination of the galaxy. The game featured epic battles on large maps, with hundreds of various ground, sea, and air units fighting on screen. One of the features of this game was the Commander, which was a strong unit with unique abilities. If the commander is killed, then it is gone for the rest of the match, or the player can lose the entire game if the win condition is set to commander death. The game was also one of the first to have unit order queues, such as setting up a patrol route, constructing buildings, or attacking enemy units. The resource system for the game was different compared to other RTS games of this time, in that the player would accumulate resources at a constant rate, rather than in small batches, and the resources were unlimited. If the rate at which resources are spent is higher than the rate resources are gathered, then the player's reserves will be depleted. And if the reserves are fully depleted, then the production across the board will slow. In-game, this was known as nano-stalling. Graphically, the game looks as if it is 3D, but when doing research for the game, it seems like it's actually 2D, at least when it comes to the map terrain, but it has various height map values which make it look and act like a 3D surface. The units themselves, however, are actual 3D models. By the end of October, the game had shipped 250,000 units worldwide, and the game was well reviewed by critics and won several awards for Best Strategy Game of the Year in 1997. Just 1 month after Total Annihilation's release, Ensemble Studios, with Microsoft as their publisher, would release their first game, Age of Empires, in October 1997. The game was the first historically based real-time strategy game. The player could play one of 12 civilizations, starting from the Stone Age and taking up to the Iron Age. Some of these civilizations included Egyptians, Greeks, Babylonians, and Persians. The game was like previous RTSs such as Command & Conquer and Warcraft, in that the player used villagers to gather nearby resources to construct new buildings, units, and upgrades. Those resources being food, wood, gold, and stone. The town center was the most important building, as it was where the player would train villagers and advance to the next age, as well as increase the player's population. The game also featured wonders, which were large and unique monuments that represent great architectural wonders of the time period. Under standard victory conditions, a player could win the game by building a wonder and preventing it from being destroyed by other players for 10 minutes, or 2,000 years in in-game time. The game had a campaign where the player follows the history of 4 of the civilizations in the game, and also a game mode called Random Map, which generated a different map for each new skirmish match. Age of Empires was a great financial success for Ensemble Studios and Microsoft. It was well received by critics, but more importantly, by the end of 1997, sales in the US were above 178,000 units, for revenues of over $8 million. Worldwide, the game had sold through 850,000 units by February of 1998. Later that year, the game got its first expansion, The Rise of Rome, which added 3 new playable civilizations, and new maps and units as well. In March 1998, Blizzard would come back strong with a new sci-fi RTS title, Starcraft. The game took place in the far future of the Milky Way galaxy, in the Koprulu sector, where three alien races, the humans, Protoss, and Zerg, fight with each other and themselves over control of the sector. Now, the story of Starcraft itself is more complicated than that, but I don't have time to dive that deep into it for this video. The gameplay was similar to Blizzard's previous game, Warcraft 2, with base building, resource gathering, and unit micro. Each of the three factions are unique in their buildings, units, and strategies that they use to win. One example is the Zerg can only construct base buildings on creep, or the Protoss only being able to construct buildings within range of their pylons. The campaign also featured hero units for each faction, which were stronger than a standard unit, such as Jim Raynor for the Terran and Zeratul for the Protoss. The game also featured many other improvements from Warcraft 2, like a better UI, compelling storyline, and improved graphics and pre-rendered cinematics.
Looks like you mashed some poor fella's dog, Sarge.
It's a Zerglin, Lester.
The soundtrack to the game saw the return of composer Glenn Stafford, who composed the Terran and Protoss themes, while Derek Duke worked on the music for the Zerg. Hayes and Tracy Bush also contributed to the soundtrack as well. Most importantly though, multiplayer was handled through Blizzard's Battle.net service. This came included with ranked and unranked game modes, and custom user-created content as well. Starcraft was the best PC game for the year of 1998, selling over 1.5 million copies worldwide and received positive reviews by critics. Starcraft's popularity in South Korea exploded shortly after its release, quickly developing a pro gaming scene and eventually becoming the country's national esport. Starcraft games were broadcast on television channels, and pro gamers in South Korea became celebrities, gaining sponsorships, television contracts, and tournament prizes. The game's esports scene would only grow even further with the release of its expansion, Starcraft Brood War, in December 1998. The expansion continued the storyline of the game and added new maps and units for each of the three factions. It also included some new music and more of Blizzard's top-notch cinematics.
Take us into orbit, Mr. Malmsteen. We've seen enough.
Planet Arrakis, known as Dune.
Westwood would sort of release a new game in September 1998, that game being Dune 2000. Now I say sort of, because Dune 2000 was really more of a remake or remaster of the original Dune 2. However, the story of this game differs from the original in Dune 2, and also features full live-action cutscenes like in their previous Command & Conquer games. It also came with improvements compared to Dune 2, such as a better UI, improved graphics, and gameplay, such as buildings being constructed on concrete not deteriorating at all due to the harsh environment of Arrakis. Overall, the game was not as well received by critics compared to Westwood's previous games, but they would make up for that in August 1999 with the release of the sequel to the first Command & Conquer game.
In the name of Cain! In the name of Cain! In the name of Cain! Cain lives!
Command & Conquer: Tiberian Sun continues the story from the first Command & Conquer game, also known as Tiberian Dawn, with the setting of the game being in the year 2030, taking place 30 years after the first Tiberium War, and now much of the Earth is covered in the alien crystal known as Tiberium. The struggle for dominance and survival of the human race between GDI and the Brotherhood of Nod resumes with the return of Cain, the leader of the Brotherhood, who was previously presumed killed by GDI forces in the previous game. The game also improved on many aspects of the previous Command & Conquer games, such as better pathfinding and no unit population cap. The game had an improved graphics engine, featuring terrain with various height levels, a dynamic lighting system with a day and night cycle, as well as improved 3D cutscenes to go along with the live-action ones. Frank Klepacki once again composing the soundtrack for the game with the help of Jared Mendelsohn. The soundtrack greatly complements the dark and depressing atmosphere of the Tiberian scarred Earth. An expansion pack called Firestorm would release at the beginning of March in the year 2000, and continue the story of the series after the end of the GDI campaign from Tiberian Sun. The highly anticipated game was yet another financial success for Westwood, and their new publisher Electronic Arts. It was the fastest selling game under the EA label, with revenues of $18.6 million in the United States by the end of the year 1999. In late September 1999, a new game studio in Vancouver, Canada would release their first video game, a game which would go on to become the highest rated PC game of 1999.
The mothership has cleared the scaffold. We are away.
Relic Entertainment, led by Alex Garden and Luke Maloney, with publisher Sierra Studios, would release Homeworld, a real-time strategy game set fully in space, where the player controls a faction known as the Kushan Exiles of the planet Karak, and follows them along their journey through space in search of their ancient homeworld. Along the way in their mothership, they encounter various other factions such as pirates, traitors, and rebels. What really allowed Homeworld to stand out from other RTS games at this time was that each level was a full 3-dimensional sphere rather than 2-dimensional plane. Players could command their units to move anywhere within this sphere. The game's camera can also lock onto a ship and follow it, which makes for some fun cinematic moments during combat. The player could also group and set units in specific formations for attacking and defending against enemies. Another feature during the campaign was that the units built and resources collected in one level would carry over to the next level. All unit construction was done through the mothership, which acted as the mobile base. This also separated it from many of the previous RTS games, since it meant the game did not involve the construction of multiple buildings to grow a static base. But the fact that the player still has a base, and that units can be built from it and receive upgrades from it, means that in my opinion, it still fits within the core pillar of base building that we established at the beginning of this video, thereby making it an RTS game. The game also came with skirmish and multiplayer game modes, where the default objective would be to capture or destroy the enemy mothership. Homeworld was a complete financial success for Relic, selling over 500,000 copies in the initial 6 months after its release. The game was highly regarded among critics at the time, and received or was nominated for Best RTS and/or PC Game of the Year awards for 1999. Just 2 days after the release of Homeworld, in late September 1999, Ensemble Studios and Microsoft would return with the sequel to Age of Empires, Age of Empires 2, The Age of Kings. Unlike the first game, which took place at the dawn of civilization, Age of Empires 2 was set in the Middle Ages and had 13 playable civilizations, including the Britons, Franks, Mongols, Japanese, Turks, and many more. The game featured 5 campaigns which were historically based, including Saladin's defense of the Holy Land and Genghis Khan's invasion of Eurasia. The game doesn't change much compared to the original, as a sequel does the things that most game sequels do, which is fix any issues from the first while also improving on other aspects, such as the game having better unit pathfinding and a new AI system. Note that I'm using gameplay from the HD version of the game, which was released in 2013 by Skybox Labs. The game still features a heavy focus on gathering multiple resources such as food, wood, and stone, building up your town, and creating large armies to defeat one's opponents with. Players advance through 4 new ages, those being the Dark Age, Feudal Age, Castle Age, and the Imperial Age. Each civilization also has a unique wonder, specialized unit, and civilization bonuses, such as the Byzantines having increased building health per age, the Chinese being able to construct the Temple of Heaven wonder, or Britons having longbowmen, which are an archery unit with increased range compared to a standard archer. In addition to the single player, the game also featured multiplayer with up to 8 players being able to take part in one game. The game was a major commercial success, with Microsoft having shipped 2 million copies 3 months after its release, and the game was highly praised among critics at the time, with some critics nominating and awarding it Strategy Game of the Year and Overall Game of the Year. An expansion called The Conquerors would release in August 2000 and add 5 new civilizations, new campaigns, maps, units, and gameplay modes to the original game. The expansion generated $6 million in revenue by October 2000 in the United States alone. Age of Empires 2 solidified Ensemble Studios as being one of the best RTS developers, and a worthy competitor in a genre which has so far been dominated by Westwood and Blizzard. The game also proved that the genre could be highly successful set in a historical time period, and not just limiting itself purely to fantasy or sci-fi settings. Looking at the timeline of releases that we've been following throughout this video, we can see between 1995 and 1999 the rapid rise of the real-time strategy game genre. From the dominance of Westwood Studios and Blizzard Entertainment from 1995 to 1997, to the new and successful contenders of Cave Dog Entertainment, Ensemble Studios, and Relic in the years from 1997 to 1999. I also want to quickly mention that there were other RTS games that were also released during this time period, such as Warwind, Earth 2140, and Dark Reign: The Future of War. But for this video and time period, I wanted to focus on the more well-known titles in the genre. One could lead to the conclusion that the mid to late 1990s were the golden age of the RTS genre. However, in my opinion, these were just what I would consider to be the beginnings or early years of the genre. Thanks to the massive and critical success of Age of Empires 2, the start of the golden age for the genre itself would ultimately begin near the end of the 20th century, and brought on by the same developers that laid the foundations for the genre back in 1992, with Dune 2, The Building of a Dynasty.
Is it done, Yuri?
No, Comrade Premier. It has only begun.
Thanks to everyone for taking the time to watch this in-depth video, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And consider subscribing to the channel in order to stay tuned for part 2 of this series, where we'll take a look at the video games that defined the golden age of the RTS genre.